Spotify wrote a blank check and said, whatever it takes to announce to the world that Spotify is not just a music streaming platform, it is also a podcast platform. So just go spend whatever it takes to get big names that will make splashy announcements, the Obamas, Meghan and Harry, I mean, you name it.
The way that Spotify approached podcasting originally feels similar to how the likes of Saudi Arabia are approaching sport at the moment. They're trying to just host all the boxing events, they're trying to have the best footballers there, and it's not to make money, it's to be like, everyone look at us, we want to be number one.
I think the interesting thing is to me, the very deeply researched, deeply architected kind of stories are what's near and dear to my heart. But the audience is telling us different. What they want is people sitting around talking like this. And that is ultimately a less expensive kind of show.
Thank you very much for joining us, Courtney.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Good. How did you get started in the podcasting game? Take us back to the start to give us a bit of context how you got into podcasting.
Oh gosh, how long do you have? I mean, so my short answer is that audio has been the through line of my life. I started as a music journalist back in Seattle in the grunge days. I can tell you all about seeing Nirvana at small venues and all of that. But I also would listen to NPR all the time, which is like our BBC basically. And so it was like the spoken word and music and, you know, always having headphones on like this, or not exactly like this, much cheaper. But I realized that I spend most of my time listening to things. And I had been both a digital journalist and a like written word journalist. And I realized like the way that in which I like to consume content is through my ears. And so I sort of carved a path for myself towards this. I had been working at Discovery, and before that I was at Yahoo. I was at MTV Radio, MTV VH1 Radio, which was sort of a combination of my audio music and spoken word. But then I was like, podcasts are really my speed. I saw a job listing for Audible, which actually was a week after. I told you this would be long and meandering. Picture this. I'm commuting from New York City to New Jersey, which may mean nothing over the UK, but you have to go through this treacherous tunnel that is ancient and crumbling on a train. And you come up and you're finally like back into the world. And one of the first stops is in Newark, New Jersey. And there's like a beacon is the building that Audible is in. And at the time, you know, it's got the logo with the sound waves. And I'm with my cousin and I said to her, I want to work there. 2 weeks later, I found that Discovery was basically eliminating my job. And like the day prior to that, they posted an Audible job to lead sort of their short form content service, which was then called Channels, to work with someone named Eric Newsom, who I deeply respect. If you've heard of him, he writes a newsletter called The Audio Insurgent. Anyway, applied, got the interview, got the job, and sort of the rest is history. You know, my work at Audible sort of crossed both podcasts and audiobooks, which is the bread and butter of Audible. And I really wanted to specialize specifically in podcasts. So then I started to cast about when it was sort of the peak, the final peak before the downfall, which we can get into, of like the podcast gold rush. Spotify was investing a ton of money in podcasts. I was interviewing there. I'd interviewed for a job at Gimlet, and it ended up going to a more talented person named Nicole Beamster-Boer. Hi, Nicole. But they liked me a lot, and they said, okay, we'll keep you, you know, in our files, which is always, you think, a bunch of BS. But not long after that, they called me and they said, Spotify Originals is looking for a creative executive, one of their lead creative executives, to kind of be the bridge between something like Gimlet and the Spotify mothership. And if you need me to explain what Gimlet was RIP, I can. Anyway, I got that job and it was great. until the bottom started to fall out of the industry. And I was one of the lucky few, and then the lucky many who got an exit package. And I've sort of been figuring out what's next.
So how many years ago did you start at Audible?
Oh my gosh. I have to do this by how old my kid is. I think it was I want to say 2017.
Okay, so you've been in the podcasting space for a long time.
Long relative to your age, less long relative to my age, but yes.
Yeah, I definitely think relative to industry as well, because realistically, most of the bigger shows have sort of started around lockdown and since. There's not been too many that superseded that. So when you say sort of the industry fell out, let's sort of get into it, because this is what I really wanted to cover, because it seemed to be, from my perspective anyway, sort of a golden period throughout 2020 and 2021 where companies were borrowing money for next to nothing and investing a lot. And Spotify seemed to sort of think, okay, this is how we win, and we just put a load of cash into podcasting and let's just become the podcasting people. And then every so often on the various newsletters I'm signed up to, it's like, oh, Spotify've made 10,000 people redundant or whatever it is. It's just like people constantly being let go. So what happened?
Oh my gosh, what happened? Well, people who are much more articulate on the business end of things will be able to explain this better. But I think pretty much the greater understanding in a very reductive way is that Spotify wrote a blank check to announce to the world, or, Daniel Ek gave the content team a blank check and said, whatever it takes to announce to the world that Spotify is not just a music streaming platform, it is also a podcast platform. And not only that, the best podcast platform. So just go spend whatever it takes to get big names that will make splashy announcements and tell the world that this is where you can come get exclusively some of the world's best podcasts and the world's best people, the Obamas, Meghan and Harry, Bad Robot. I mean, you name it. So that was the metric at the time, was money is no object. Spend what you need to get people here. And they did. And I think, I haven't checked lately, but I think it is still the most used podcast platform. So by that metric, that, I guess, strategy worked to fulfill the goal of getting people to Spotify to listen to podcasts. But then they needed to sort of rejigger the goalpost and decide, actually, the goal is to make money on podcasts. We need these to have... Yeah, right. Capitalism, it's a thing. So then the goalpost moved, and it was like, okay, actually, we need to not just make a return on an investment, but have these be profitable. And I actually had dinner last night with a former Spotify colleague, and I think they've done that. But as you know, they've had to go to extreme measures to do that.
Do it the brutal way.
Yeah.
So how many people are realistically involved in an operation like that? So let's say you worked on the Meghan podcast, amongst others, but how many people from acquiring and signing a talent like that to the planning, the production, the marketing, how many people are required for just one show like that?
Well, it depends on who's making it, right? But at Spotify, because we have to make sure we're all buttoned up with, any legal things that would come up, clearances. Spotify doesn't do fair use when it comes to using clips from old shows, which, Meghan was a host on Deal or No Deal. And so, we had to license a clip for that. Certain songs she wanted to use, we would have to license those. And so there would be the legal department and the clearances department. And then, back to the deal making people, there was, Dawn Ostroff was the head of content at the time. So she probably, started the deal along with Courtney Holt. And then, then she has the business affairs people. And I know this is becoming yammering, but it's all meant to just say, even before it sees the light of day or the light of ears. There's all of these people just kind of doing the business work that is required. In terms of producing it, we did co-produce with Gimlet. Again, RIP. We had an editor. We had several researchers. We had people who would do sort of interview prep and pre-interview and booking of guests. Both the big names like Serena Williams and then sort of the experts like Rebecca Traister. And then there would be, myself and a talent person, a talent sort of producer on Meghan's end. Yeah. And then, of course, I haven't even mentioned Archwell yet, but there's a whole Archwell Foundation operation, which has its own marketing team and its own head of audio, who at the time was Rebecca Sananes, who also, shout out, great person. So I don't think I've even covered it all, but the long story short is I think you two plus whoever I'm hearing in the background are like the whole operation. It's quite orders of magnitude beyond that to make a podcast like
that
Archetypes.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It feels, the way that Spotify approached podcasting originally feels similar to how the likes of Saudi Arabia are approaching sport at the moment, in the sense that they're trying to just host all the boxing events. They're trying to have the best footballers there. And it's not to make money. It's to be like, everyone look at us. We want to be number one.
Okay.
But then that approach doesn't make sense financially. Like you said, if you then go from, cool, let's throw all this money at the best footballers, or in this case, the best podcasters, to then go, well, actually, now I want to see a return, is a whole different approach. So I'm imagining on these shoots and beyond that, like you say, before any content sees the light of day, there's so many people involved. Do you feel like there was a lot of people involved for the sake of it that didn't need to be there?
You don't have to name names.
Yeah. So this person. But did you feel like they went over the top? It's like, actually, you didn't need this. You didn't need this. You didn't need this.
It's hard to say. I mean, for something at the level of scrutiny as, a Meghan Markle that gets, the Daily Mail exists solely to write about her, apparently. You have to be so buttoned up and careful, leaving aside all of the financial considerations. Just like I said, like everything was fact checked within an inch of its life and legal clearances. So nobody would come at us with a lawsuit if we used it. So I don't know if the problem was the number of people involved. I think even they would say we overpaid. We paid Hollywood money for audio content, and the math does not add up. And by that I mean the money we paid in our deals to these big names.
What sort of money are you looking to secure? Because was it like a season? Did you pay them, say, for X amount of episodes, X amount of time? Like, what are we talking?
This is where I start to get aware of my NDA that I signed for Spotify.
Yeah. There's something you can't say, of course, don't worry about it. But
some of the, you can look up. There's been a lot of good reporting on this in various business journals. But yeah, there was a contract that was, you do X number of episodes per X number of seasons. And that ended up ultimately getting terminated before all of that saw the light of day. Again, there's a lot of ink spilled on all of that as well. So,
So those business journals are a bit more reliable than the Daily Mail then, yeah?
I would say yes.
Good.
It's funny. So from how he speaks about it, Joe Rogan, he mentions a lot that he wanted to keep as much control over it as possible, and it didn't want to change from its original format. And I don't know behind the scenes, but it seems like there's probably a lot less people involved in his podcast than some of the others, yet it seems to be the most successful acquisition that Spotify's had. So perhaps less chefs is better?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, let's see, how could I say this? Yes, fewer chefs were involved, but like Joe Rogan was already in the business of making a podcast or a video cast or whatever you want to call it. And so it was just, all right, come over to us, be exclusive to us. So people have to come to, and I keep saying us, even though we broke up, but be exclusive to Spotify, and come to us if you're a Joe Rogan fan or listener or watcher, and so in terms of like the production or the clearances, that was all like on his end, hands off. And, there's been some controversy around that as well, but it's a completely different kind of show than Archetypes. So it is not apples to apples. So
when you're working with royals like that, obviously there's so many hoops to jump through. Like you said, there's no way of avoiding it. It's not something you can say, oh, we just won't bother doing that. So it completely makes sense why it had to happen. But do you feel like all those extra hoops was part of the problem?
I just think that there was no way to avoid it with this particular kind of show. I think it's just, if you're a risk averse company or working with risk averse talent whose reputations are on the line, you really can't cut corners.
Of course.
And if, that's all I can say about that. I don't think that it was, I don't think they had a choice.
It just doesn't lend well to the podcast format where people are expecting certain frequency and certain more free-flowing conversations. Obviously, these people come from Hollywood and TV where it's like, okay, you get paid, you do this. It's going to be all signed off before it ever gets released, and nobody's necessarily expecting anything more. I guess, where you compare it to Joe Rogan, like you mentioned, he was already doing it. He didn't really make his name in TV, and obviously doesn't really have the same sort of scrutiny that somebody like Meghan or the Obamas would have.
Yeah.
Have you... Go on.
I mean, I will say more, which is that I think the interesting thing is I'm a journalist by training and trade to an extent, and to me, the very deeply researched, deeply architected kind of stories are what's near and dear to my heart. But the audience and the world is telling us different, like what they want is people sitting around talking like this. And that is ultimately a less expensive kind of show. But if you want to create sort of a high production, deeply researched, somewhat journalistic kind of show, it does require more people. So I do think that the industry started, I mean, pre-Serial probably, but, going back to sort of NPR, people kind of talking with each other. NPR is journalistic too, so it's not the best. Let's talk about like maybe Mark Maron, who I think predates Serial. He's a guy talking to another guy or gal. There's a lot less expense involved in two people talking, or three like we are right now. And it's interesting that for once, the masses want something that costs less to make. So I think that's the way the industry is going.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, right. Otherwise we're in trouble.
You guys going to be around for a while, I think.
Yeah, I feel like, and we speak to clients about this all the time, authenticity is one of the biggest things when it comes to podcasting. And when people listen to a podcast, it's often they want to see behind the curtain, right? So if I listen to a podcast from my favourite football pundits, I'm listening to it because I don't want the swear words bleeped out. I don't want to hear like the stuff they say on TV when they're suited up. I want to see when they're sat there relaxed, what their actual opinions are. That's the beauty of a podcast to me. And I feel like that's just not something that's possible when you work with someone like Meghan, right? Because there is no way of going, oh, well, let's just drop our guard because the Daily Mail they're watching the podcast before it's even released, right? So, and I'm sure they're not the only ones. So it almost feels as though those personalities where they are so big that they physically can't do the kind of, here's the behind the scenes look, that just podcasting doesn't suit that sort of person.
I would say yes. I know you don't just want a one-word answer, but I will correct you. We were very protective of the episodes, and we did not give out like pre-release listens or anything. So they were just very fast. They just have an army of people ready to jump on something. Right?
They were refreshing Spotify.
Yes. Yes.
Have you done much work with independent creators, perhaps at Audible or when you were doing audiobooks? Is there a big difference in not just working with them, but how that sort of show might succeed? Because I have a feeling sort of the marketing strategy that you guys might use for a celeb would be entirely different to something that we would suggest for somebody who's not known and using their podcast to become known.
Yeah, I mean, on the Spotify and Audible level to an extent, because Audible is an Amazon company, so also has pretty decent cash flow. Um, so, they would have to meet a bar of sort of respect or well-knownness in order to end up on Audible, at least via traditional channels. There is something on Audible called, I think the name is different now, but it was called ACX. It was the Audible, I believe that stands for Audible Creator Exchange, but don't quote me on it. And that was more of the like upstart kind of, I don't have an agent, I don't have a publisher, I don't have anything except myself and my story to tell. And so I'm going to record it and I'm going to upload it and hope for the best. And that's actually how, I don't know if you've heard of Mel Robbins, but that's how she got her start. She's a huge success story for Audible. And I did have the opportunity to interview her. And she is, people like that who have the hunger and are going to just find a way to get out there and make their voice heard are really great. And they are the kind of people that you do want to work with, because there's no dragging them to the mic. Not that there was with anyone I've worked with who shan't be named, but they just kind of, they're themselves, to your point about authenticity. And she doesn't, gloss over anything. She tells the truth about her story, and she's kind of, in her advice, she's hard on herself and hard on other people. Anyway, I could go off, but I think Mel Robbins is a good example of someone who was like, I just have to be heard, and I don't need a huge paycheck at the beginning to get there. I'm just going to get there.
Yeah, she is awesome. How much money would Spotify or Audible spend on a marketing budget if they were launching a show?
They will come at me. I cannot give you any numbers. Okay, I'm sorry. They will come at me.
That's fine.
But let's just say, a fair amount. You can look, it's glossy, and there are people who are very well trained making it. And
at least it's good 70, 80 quid, I reckon.
Yeah.
Maybe $100.
Yeah.
No,
how much do you spend on your marketing?
Great question. Well, you'll have to apply to work with us to find out.
Exactly. Right.
For this, next to nothing, really, to be honest.
Yeah, the wages of the team to post,
right.
Mostly.
Not paid ads. It's pretty much all organic.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose with Spotify and Audible, something that we've done a little bit, but it's easier for those guys is cross promotion. If you've got a bunch of not Amazon or Spotify originals, I'm guessing I don't listen to many. I despise listening to podcasts on Spotify, despite using Spotify exclusively for music.
Really?
It's weird. Like if anyone says they use Apple Music, I'm like, you're a sicko. Spotify only. But then if somebody tells me to listen to their podcast on Spotify, I'm like, oh no, I can't mix.
So you mean that blank check that Daniel Ek wrote to make sure everybody listens to podcasts on Spotify did not work for you?
No, it did not. No, absolutely not a chance. No, I would never. I actually, not that I listened avidly, but I think I've listened to one Joe Rogan episode since he moved, just because it broke my routine. Like it was too much friction, which is, interesting user behavior. Mm-hmm. But
also the SEO for our show on Spotify is rubbish, which makes me like it even less.
Yeah.
Although ranking when the three words in your podcast are the podcasters and podcast is quite difficult.
Yeah, it's dreadful. For
it's a great name, as I told you. You know what you're getting with this podcast.
Yeah, very true. It's just hard to find.
Yeah.
Cool. You mentioned, Courtney, that tragically you and Spotify broke up. Obviously, you weren't the only one in that situation. There was a lot of people that they broke up with. Do you feel like where their business was and how their goals changed, that was the right decision from them?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about, right? So if you're the business person and you're saying we need to make a return on this investment, you're going to have to cut some costs. And I guess overhead is the easiest way to do that. Yeah, I mean, I think they overspent in the beginning, and I think that's not just true of Spotify. You're seeing headlines today about Odyssey having to lay off some people, and SiriusXM has had to as well. So I can't just point the finger at Spotify, but it does seem like it is the go-to way to tell both Wall Street and the bean counters in your business, we're actually going to get our financial act together. So I get it. I've been in media a long time. It's not endemic only to podcasts to have to make those kinds of cuts. You're seeing it in a lot of media businesses right now as well. So LA Times just cut 20% of their newsroom staff, I think. I could go on. So I don't know if I think I've sort of danced around the question a bit, but I think it's not untrue.
No, that's quite good.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that makes sense. We saw earlier today, didn't we? There was a headline on Pod News, and it was one of Spotify shows, the big one. What's it called?
Call Her Daddy.
Call Her
It's
Daddy.
not an exclusive anymore.
Yeah.
What's happening with that?
Do you think that's related to their change of approach and kind of what they're wanting to get out of working with these shows?
I mean, if monetization is the goal, and you've already achieved your goal of having, or profitability is the goal, and you've achieved your initial goal of having people come to your platform, you no longer need that lever as a way to achieve your new goal, which is make money, be profitable. I can't say I'm not there anymore. But I would guess that this is, I mean, we've seen it with other shows too, some of which no longer exist, but that they did that with a lot of the Gimlet shows. They put them out for wide distribution. And I think even the creators behind it would be happy about that because more people have access to their content.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. How do these companies kill off podcasts? It sounds really aggressive.
Yeah.
But so I've seen it where sometimes they'll pay for them, they get an exclusive, and 6 months later they're like, oh, this show doesn't exist anymore. Is that a mutual breakup? So does the creator get to say, I'll get the rights back and I'll just carry on producing it by myself? Or because Spotify own it or have a license over it, do they say, no, this ceases to exist? How does that breakup work?
I think it's typically usually driven by money and how much the show costs. But yeah, I mean, I think these are the kind of things that I should not be speaking to because I'm not there anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, you've left Spotify now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, as someone not being part of Spotify, do you think they'll acquire any more massive names in the way they did with Meghan, in the way they did with the Obamas? Do you reckon they'll take that approach again at all?
I mean, I think it's been like, listen, I don't know. I think because you'll hear that, that's no longer their business goal again to, sort of acquire listeners because, through these big names. I wouldn't have maybe predicted that Trevor Noah was going to have a show there, but he does, and it's doing great. And who knows if they're going to do more of that. The whole business is contracting. They say we're not in a recession, but everybody's tightening the purse string. So I do think that if they were to acquire big talent, it would probably not be under the same kind of deal structure or numbers that it was in the past. I think those days are behind us because of a lot of economic wins.
Where do you see opportunities for podcasters? Is there certain niches or industries that are underserved? Like if you're a sort of a fresh podcaster listening to this, where would you see the opportunities?
I love that you use the word niche and this took some convincing for me. I believe it was Corinne Gilliard who I worked with at Spotify and has now moved on to Higher Ground to be, I think, one of their very high up audio executives. She said niche is broad, which is sort of like the contradiction of the term itself, but it's if you can find a highly passionate community about a specific topic. You guys have mentioned sports a couple times now. Like you look at Travis Kelce, it is Jason Kelce's podcast, which
Huge.
Ostensibly is about sports, but there are definitely some Taylor Swift fans listening to.
Yeah.
I would like to know how much of that's about sports.
Yeah. But point is, like, I think if you can look to, and I think too often, I will caveat by saying that too often right now, as podcast business is casting about for a new strategy, people will look to things like TikTok. But I will say there are some things that I think would translate, trends that would translate, which is to say, my For You page is all about the things that I search for on there. And there's a ton of content there of that particular vertical. And people who are very specialized in that and can speak at length and any number of subtopics on that topic. For me, it happens to be ADHD because it's in my family. I think that hyper focusing on a particular topic, and I guess that falls broadly under the subject of mental health. I think you see a lot on mental health TikTok, and I think you don't see as much mental health podcast breaking out. But I think that is an opportunity where people love to listen to it. People love to get advice. Another area that I do a lot of my own listening in, so this is just exclusively me search, but parenting. So you guys aren't parents, I assume, but when you are a parent, you're just sort of like, what is going on with my child? Does this happen to everyone? And there's some sort of, even if it's just two parents talking, not an expert or anything, just hearing them say, oh my God, my kid did this too. There's a sense of peace around it and community. And so I do think some of those more very specific vertical topics are a way for people to break in. If it's something that you yourself can't stop talking about and you have aspirations of having a show, just go for it. There's probably an audience.
Yeah, I love that. I think people are almost scared. They go, oh, I need to try and please everyone because, I don't want to launch it and have 0 listeners. And then that ends up being the thing that gives them 0 listeners because you're no different than anyone else. There's a million comedy shows out there and I'm going to listen to the one who's a comedian who sells out arenas, not some random I don't know.
Right.
So I think niching is important. Is there any particular niches that you've seen other than mental health that perhaps are underutilized or there's not many people there?
I don't know. I feel like I would say sports, but that's just because I don't listen to it. The Ringer and Bill Simmons would be like, yeah, no, we're fine. We have enough going on. I don't know. I think if there is a very devoted community, like I always used to tell interns when I was at MTV Radio, like, what are you out talking to your friends about when you go have drinks after work? That's not nothing. It's a form of me search, but it's also trust that. Don't look to industry titans or people who've been established to tell you what is going to work. Listen to yourself, listen to what your friends are talking about, and guess what? There's probably something there.
What can you teach podcasters about growing their show? Is there anything actionable that people could implement that isn't just spend $1 billion on a PR campaign for like celebrities?
Well, you mentioned, I think already sort of cross promotion. And I don't even just mean like mentioning another show on your show. It's guesting, like on, guest swapping. I think that's the best way to do it. And then maybe, let's say I was going to guest on Mel Robbins' show, but let's say that I also have a big show of my own. It would be great for me, which would no doubt be a smaller show if I were the host, because I am not Mel Robbins. If we were to have that episode that featured me on Mel Robbins in my feed as well. And, so literal cross promotion, literal guest swapping, I think it's the cheapest and actually probably more effective than a lot of the marketing spends that are out there. Way 100%. To grow.
Yeah. People underestimate how important collaboration is, right? And your biggest competitors are often your biggest collaborators in the podcast space. It's a bit different to most forms of media, right? Yeah. I've got a couple of questions, one for the future, one for the past. Knowing what you know now, if you could rewind to the start of working on that Meghan project, is there any things you would approach differently?
That's a great question. I would have recorded 2 seasons at once because I would have really liked to have more than one season. Not that that's super easy, but we all worked very hard, and I'm sure the many talented people at Gimlet and Archwell who worked with me on it are like, "Are you kidding me? It was hard enough getting that one series out or one season out." Yeah, I would have maybe cut. Just back to your point about were there too many people? I might have advocated for fewer rounds of notes, fewer cuts, and do sort of more like we're doing now. I mean, ultimately, the end product did sound like what we're doing, but there was a lot of behind the scenes work in terms of like shifting topics and, so yeah, maybe be a little more off the cuff if we could. You said that maybe she couldn't, but I heard her speak impromptu to a group of Spotify employees, and it was just, I was like, why didn't we record this? It was pitch perfect. Like,
here's the
and
podcast.
It's done. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's fair enough. You mentioned getting the actual content recorded was tough. Obviously, it was widely reported that she wasn't at some of the interviews. Was that really tough to organise?
I don't think the recording itself was tough. And just to clarify, and Andy Scott, who was an incredible editor on the show, so give her a shout. We never even pretended that some of those interviews were with Meghan. So I would just say some of the expert interviews were just, it wasn't meant to be a back and forth. It wasn't like something where it was never like a Serena Williams, of course, where we edited in her voice after. Those interviews she did do, but when we got sound bites from experts, it was never even presented as if it were a two-way with Meghan. It was, we spoke to these experts. Yeah.
It's not what the Daily Mail said.
Yeah.
I know. Can you believe it? The Daily Mail was not right. Yeah.
No, fair enough. My question for the future is now, obviously, like you said, broke up with Spotify. What's the future for you, Courtney? How are you going forward in the podcasting space?
I mean, I've had some time, and I've deliberately been slow to make my next official move. I mean, I'm loosely consulting, but I do like having a professional home that I can grow with, and grow teams and all have a shared goal. I went on a hike recently with one of my most trusted sort of mentors, colleagues, advisors, like a dorky word, but she was like, "Do you still want to be in audio?" And I said, I still love audio. I don't want to give up on it. It is the best. And I think there is still a lot of hope for it. It just needs to recalibrate its business model. And I'm hoping that I can continue to be a part of it because it is very near and dear to me.
So it's interesting you say business model. So from the world that you come from, is it pretty much ad revenue and subscription revenue from Spotify? Is that essentially the only way that they generate income from their shows?
Podcasters, period, or
from your experience? So the podcasters, I guess they just get paid from Spotify. That's their payday. But I guess Spotify, is it mostly just ads and the subscription revenue?
Yes, but I would say more generally speaking for the I would say actually, yes, it's asterisk. I don't know the whole business end. I was a creative. So, and am, but when I speak about the industry overall, I'm not just talking about Spotify or Audible. I'm saying, I think there are creative ways for especially new creators and independent creators to come about. Having a Patreon is one of them. I think there are a lot of people out there who also want to see podcasting survive. I mean, in the same way that you found me because I'm sort of a patron of this newsletter, Pod News, right? I think that's how you found me, because I pay them. I love their work. And so I am sponsoring them, sort of. I think the same is true of individuals. If I don't know, if Brene Brown were to go independent and say the only way to hear my podcast is if I have enough Patreon subscribers, I would absolutely pony up. And I think there are ways. You don't even need to do it through Patreon. I'm just describing the model of a way that people can make a living outside of the ecosystem of the Apple Podcasts and Amazons of the world.
It's funny how Patreon's kind of become a verb like Google, because we do the same thing. Anytime we talk about membership site, it just say Patreon is a synonym. But it's like, oh wait, there's so much free promotion going on. There's other platforms are available. But
that's when you made it, when you become a verb, right? So
100%.
They've done a good job.
Just a quick one. A couple of things you were saying were I might have been understanding them wrong, but do you feel like podcasting is going in the wrong direction, or have I just understood a couple of things you were saying wrong?
I mean, I think you mentioned all the newsletters you read, and it's been interesting when I go out to like cocktails or happy hour or something, if it's not specific to the podcast business, and I say, oh yeah, well, I mean, we're in a downturn. They're like, really? There's so many podcasts I listen to. I'm listening all the time. What are you talking about? I love podcasts. What? And so I may be in the bubble of seeing about all the headlines about layoffs and, deals ending, etc. So I don't think the content itself is in a downturn. I just think
maybe famous podcasters.
Maybe. And I think the ways in which we've previously looked at, keeping it afloat, like you said, advertising, subscriptions in terms of like an Audible. I think those will work for some people, but I think not everyone. So I think things like independent, paying to support independent creators, their fans, their followings is another way that hopefully we can survive.
So do you think, if I was to say in 5 years' time, what do you think podcasting will look like? What do you think would be the differences?
Well, not to go on another sort of doom and gloom route, another bubble that I find myself in a lot is journalism dying on the vine? And we talked about this a bit too, like the number of people involved. I mean, we've always, in all my conversations about podcasts everywhere I've worked, it's been journalism is expensive. So I would say 5 years from now, there will be fewer journalistic podcasts, except for those maybe sponsored by the NPRs or the BBCs, which, have government funding and ongoing fundraising campaigns in the case of NPR. But I would say other outlets are going to be less likely to invest in the more expensive, especially because, as we said earlier, the audience isn't necessarily big enough to justify the investment in these. Sadly, I'm one of the listeners, but I realize, again, I'm a focus group of one, and I alone cannot support a Pulitzer Prize level journalistically reported podcast. But I think there will be even more chat shows than there are now. Whether they will all have an audience remains to be seen. I still think there is something to be said for quality. I don't think chat show necessarily equals garbage content. You're glad to hear, I'm sure. But I think there's just a lot more room for experimentation and low barrier to entry for chat shows. And so I think we'll still have a lot of those. And I think there will still be a huge amount of content to listen to. If not more. It's just the more expensive content might be harder to find.
So there'll be less of the big high production. We're not seeing another Meghan Markle podcast then? You don't think we'll see as many of those style of 100 chefs, more of the actually here's a couple of guys just doing it with one team member style podcast?
Or a couple of gals or a couple of non-binary folks, but yes.
Yeah, of course.
No, it's fine. I'm just being me, yeah.
Do you think you can grow a podcast nowadays without a video version and social media? As a lover of audio, can you do it?
It's interesting. It's of course. I mean, there's a reason. I've said that Spotify is the biggest platform, but I think it's actually YouTube. But when it comes to just pure audio podcasts, I think that Spotify is still number one. But I haven't looked at the numbers lately. All to say, I think again, to reference the Travis Kelce podcast, I think it started on YouTube. It's a video podcast. Joe Rogan, of course. While it's not the way that I consume podcasts, again, focus group of one. There's clearly an audience for video podcasts, and I think it just needs a rename. It's weird, like in thinking about, is it still a podcast if it doesn't live just in your iPod or whatever? Like even the iPod doesn't exist anymore. So I think that video is definitely going to continue to grow. And at some point it may even overtake the audio specific podcasts. So
I'm on your team though, Courtney. I prefer to listen than watch.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, it's not as portable, right? Like I'm a multitasker by nature. That's how I mostly got into podcasts, is that I needed something when I was doing something mundane to keep me company, and doing the dishes, doing the laundry, tuning out my children, going on a walk, right? And I don't understand people who do they sit and just watch it and that's the only thing they're doing? I guess it's like TV.
I can't sit and watch it like that. I mean, I use YouTube Shorts or TikTok to discover podcasts quite often through clips, but I'm not gonna then watch the whole episode. I'll put it on when I drive half an hour somewhere.
So you do think that kind of thing is Shorts or TikToks are a good way for discovery?
That if there was only one style of video you could use, be it short form or long form, I'd definitely do short form, because it's got the more element of being pushed out to people, where people can discover you, not necessarily go from watching a 30-second video to a 30-minute podcast, but if you see enough of them, next time you're going to listen to a podcast, you might consider that one you keep seeing. But also we find for us, if we stop posting, our listeners go down. So if not attracting new listeners all the time, it helps keep you relevant to those that listen to your show quite often. They might see a clip and be like, oh, I'll listen to that when I drive later.
And it's almost like it's a trailer, and you don't have to make that extra expenditure for a trailer,
Yeah, exactly that. Because I find that trailer clips of podcast episodes rarely perform that well on social media anyway.
They have to be mega produced, don't they?
Yeah, and even then, I think one of the best at doing it is Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. His intros are really good. But then if you compare it, if you go through his Instagram feed, it's like the next clip is just an actual clip from that podcast, it'll do twice as well. So I think to an extent, they're almost wasted.
Yeah.
So, Courtney, why don't you just start a podcast of your own? If you want to get back in the game, why don't you become an indie creator?
So many people say that. It is so weird. I don't know why I have hesitation to do it. Maybe it's because I am aware of just the sheer volume of the hundreds of thousands of podcasts that are out there. I'm like, well, what do I have to add to the conversation? I'd rather find someone who has that special something and help them get there. So,
well, you could always sit there and just slag off all those famous people you've worked with and go viral.
Yeah, that's it. Work for the Daily Mail.
It might break a few NDAs.
Oh my God, no, God.
One's got Daniel Ek in the title, the next one's got Meghan Markle. Yeah, Daily Mail. There you go. I'm sure you'd be happy to slag off the Daily Mail at least.
Yeah, I'm sure that podcast already exists too, though. The slagging off Daily Mail.
You're their biggest fan, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome. Now, Courtney, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
We appreciate you. Where can everyone find you and connect with you?
Oh my gosh. I was not prepared for this. I don't have a website. I need a website. Find me on LinkedIn, because
that's where I found you.
Yes, thank you. Because that's where I actually spend most of my time networking and finding new clients or finding new opportunities. So check me out. I guess it's
and you do some consultancy work, right?
Yeah. So LinkedIn.com/Courtney Reimer. I think that's what it is. But you can just
we'll link
search.
it in the show notes so people can find you.
Thank you. Yep, and I am. I'm here to help. If you want to make a podcast, let's talk.
Thank you, Courtney. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you too.